Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Dr. John Giardini.
Thank you, Your Excellency and Mrs. Liz Scarce, Mr. David Lynn and Mrs. Liz Lynn, my wife Julia and other distinguished guests. Some of you here will have experienced great suffering, but on average, those of us in this beautiful hall have an historically unprecedented level of privilege. I encourage you to remain mindful of that as you listen to me speak this evening. As we've rightly paid our respects to the Indigenous owners of this land, this being an occasion dedicated to refugees, we should also reflect on other displaced Indigenous peoples. I draw your attention to the plight of refugees in the Old and New World. My own thoughts go to the millions of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, Gaza and elsewhere. Some of you may have spotted some interesting billboards around Adelaide in the last few days. I'd invite you to take the opportunity to be curious about what's happening in Palestine. To the staff, board and members of the Australian Refugee Association that's given nearly 40 years of wonderful service to refugees, thank you for inviting me to be the fourth ARA Orator. As David said, last year's orator was Catherine Branson QC, and she spoke of the compelling evidence of real and lasting damage done by closed detention environments. Since then, things have gone backwards with the reintroduction of offshore processing. On arrival and after initial processing, most asylum seekers don't in fact go to Nauru and Manus, where there's capacity for less than 1,000 detainees. And there are currently nearly 9,000 on Christmas Island in the mainland in immigration detention centres, or so-called alternative places of detention, which still means being unable to leave the grounds of the facility except under guard. Now, it is positive that although there are nearly 1,000 people who've been in detention for more than 6 months, the average time for people in closed detention facilities has significantly decreased from 277 days at the end of 2011 to 86 days in April this year. Another nearly 3,000 asylum seekers are in community detention, where they do have relative freedom of movement and receive support services, albeit from under-resourced agencies. And around 6,000 have been released on the new Bridging Visa E. What characterises these cruel visas is that every single arrival after August the 13th of last year is subject to removal from the Australian community to be placed in Manus and Nauru. So while there are less than 1,000 places on those islands, they loom as a continuing spectre for anybody who is under temporary protection in Australia. In 2005, it was affirmed that minors should only be detained as a measure of last resort. ALP policy in 2008 stated that children, and where possible their families, will not be detained in an immigration detention centre. Yet in April of this year, there were more children locked up, either in immigration detention centres or alternative places of detention, than ever before. Twice the 842 that were locked up at the height of the condemned Howard Ruddock regime. Another 1,200 children are in community detention. In the second ARA Oration in 2011, Malcolm Fraser summarised Australia's history of failing the human rights of refugees, tracing our indecent behaviour back to Billy Hughes. He movingly recounted the story of the Tampa and was rightly critical of the failings of both major political parties, bemoaning the demeaning and miserable debate and regretting that politicians behave with contempt towards we citizens as they appeal to the meaner side of our nature. I also share Mr. Fraser's perplexity that we don't do more to support the United Nations and other initiatives that deal with refugee problems closer to their source. The first orator was Hugh Van Lay, His story since arriving by boat in 1977 provides a wonderful example of what can be achieved when asylum seekers are treated with decency, as they no longer are. It's up to us here to work towards re-establishing a decent response to refugees. Now, decent is a difficult word. Everyone might not interpret it in the way that I want to use it, but I think the difficulty of this word is worth grappling with. Decency is a cousin to kindness and generosity, but it's not the same as either of them. There are several definitions. One that I want to avoid is in accordance with the general standard of propriety or good taste. I see that as a degraded form of decency, a kind of buttoned-up attitude. For example, dressing decently. And there's a meaning of indecent that I want to keep away from. Indecent behaviour might be a way of rebuking legitimate protest or of disliking a sexual peccadillo that's not one of your own. The meaning that I'm after is the notion of behaving in a way that's fitting, appropriate to the special requirements of the case. A decent person cannot be a person who's gotten away with something. A decent person cannot have what it's not appropriate for them to have. So, the life I lead is irredeemably corrupt. It has no justification. If it's appropriate for us to have the share of things which in fact we have, that implies that it's appropriate for all of the others to have the share which remains. You know that what you have is what you deserve, and that means what they have is what they deserve. It's appropriate for a child to be born and raised in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, just as it's appropriate for you and your friends to spend your life deciding which products you'd like to buy and upholding high standards of performance in art. The way the world works is not fundamentally unjust, so the people who want to preserve the world are basically good, and the ones who want to tear it apart, the ones who steal on the street, the thieves, the destroyers, they're basically bad. And I must acknowledge that the fact that I have lots of money isn't a fact about me like the colour of my skin. Through a series of events, the money came to me, but devoting my life to defending my possession of something that came to me is not an inescapable destiny. Keeping the money is just a choice I'm making every day. I could perfectly well put an end to the whole elaborate performance. If people are starving, give them food. If I have more than others, share what I have until I have no more than they do. Live simply, give up everything, become poor myself. Some of you may be relieved to hear that it's not me that's been speaking for the last couple of minutes, but I've been quoting the American playwright Wallace Shawn from his wonderful play, The Fever. But impractical as Shawn's solution may seem in that dividing his limited wealth won't contribute much to overall well-being, I value his formulation because it's imperative that each of us keeps the wound open, that we be reminded that the lives that you and I lead are irredeemably corrupt, because almost everything material that we have is a result of our society's exploitation of others. Now, I want to put that forward as a call to action rather than as a rationale for giving up. I think we can attenuate the grief, the guilt we rightly feel by using our privilege to do something good. It's also a call to give something substantial to others, something that I don't think that we Australians are very good at, except at times of local tragedy. In 2011, the Bhutanese community in South Australia collected nearly $2,000 for Queensland flood victims. This followed an earlier contribution to the Victorian bushfire that occurred within a year of the first Bhutanese arrivals in Australia. Perhaps the Bhutanese know better than the rest of us just how good it feels to give to people, even when those people are not just like us. We Australians per capita consume massively more than an equal share of resources, and we emit more greenhouse gases per capita than anyone. So what should we each give, either to those who are deprived or to contribute to repairing the environment? Now, giving has tax advantages as well as moral ones. Therefore, I envisage a sliding scale, starting at, say, 5% of gross salary at $80,000. True tithing at 10% should kick in from about $150,000, and 20% above $250,000. And what about the very rich? Since they don't pay much tax, their contribution should be as a percentage of real disposable income. At least 80% is proportionate and therefore decent, representing only a fraction of net assets and falling significantly short of Warren Buffett's undertaking to give away 99% of his total wealth. Decency isn't something that's owed like a duty or a right. This is illustrated by the fact that we can't make a claim in a court of law on someone to behave decently. If I had an identical twin and he was dying of renal failure and I refused to give up a kidney, that's a failure of decency on my part, but no one would have grounds to bring any action against me for that act or omission. Now, it's sometimes suggested that because to act decently demands only what's proportionate, that it falls short of more virtuous acts like kindness and generosity. But I think that fails to take account of the fact that we may have to go out of our way to act out of basic concern for others, that at times it takes great personal sacrifice to do what's objectively only proportionate. So to give an example, in Nazi Germany, to behave decently towards a Jew could be a heroic act. Consider two employers. The first is wealthy and has a profitable business. The second's on the verge of bankruptcy. Both take care to ensure that their employees are paid a fair wage for the work that they perform. On the surface, their behaviour is indistinguishable, and so might be their character and their intent. But while we wouldn't make a negative judgment about the rich employer, we would only describe the struggling employer as decent because his decency has been tested by his relative lack of resources. So the concept of decent intentions holds very little weight. We're judged by our actions. I can't be confident that I would have behaved differently from the average German in Berlin in the 30s. And I haven't found it better expressed than by Billy Bragg. Virtue never tested is no virtue at all. Just now, we're all being tested. So in order to demonstrate decent behaviour, we need not only to have basic concern for others and recognition of the need to act in proportion to what we judge to be our responsibility towards the other person. We must do all of this in the face of some significant pressure not to do so. I want to mention three forms of indecency that I think compromise us as a society. The first is nationalism. To quote from one of the few poets that I can understand, "If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori." The Latin phrase quoted by Wilfred Owen can be translated as, "It's sweet and decent to die for your country." Indeed, one of the great lies that's cost countless lives. There's exactly nothing decent about dying for your country. One should die for an idea, for a friend, or for justice, but not for nationalism. So too we should think twice about the absolute priority we set for the national interest. Is loss of life, is suffering, is joy across the border a lesser event than when it happens in our own country? I think that, like the phrase, putting my family first, nationalism is often a rationalisation for personal greed and hostility towards those we regard as aliens. My second form of indecency is globalisation. The underwear that I'm wearing tonight cost me very little. That's a product of the same circumstances that led to the death of 1,000 people when an 8-storey sweatshop collapsed in Bangladesh in April. The dead were amongst 3.2 million Bangladeshis sewing garments with a wage of not much more than $1 a day. Post-globalisation, how will we respond to the potential millions of refugees that might be created by the impact of climate change in Bangladesh? As that country sinks below higher oceans, and in fact water supplies in coastal areas are already being spoilt by saltwater incursion, is our debt for having the highest per capita carbon emissions exonerated by taking 100 Bangladeshis, 1,000, 1,000,000? My final form of indecency is neoliberalism. Can one be decent and rich? Perhaps, but there's certainly such a thing as indecent wealth. I find the rich indecent when they fail to adequately credit luck for their wealth. We find few parallels in Australia to Norway's thoughtful investment of its windfall from oil, which they do on the basis of their belief that luck is loaned, not owned. Compare this with Gina Reinhardt. There's no monopoly on becoming a millionaire. If you're jealous of those with more money, don't just sit there and complain. Do something to make money yourself. Spend less time drinking or smoking and socialising and more time working. Many rich people seem to want to have it both ways. The same prominent financiers who'd earlier claimed to have eliminated luck from investment blamed the GFC on bad luck. Now, attributing events to luck doesn't sit comfortably in our society. We have such a strong sense of agency, and we're forever looking for somebody to blame, whether it's Muslims or Julia Gillard or people smugglers. It's interesting, isn't it, that we get much more angry about the harm done by people smugglers who bring us a commodity that we don't want, that is refugees, than we do with sweatshop owners who give us commodities that we do want, that is cheap underpants. Anyway, due to a variety of circumstances, some of which are outside our control, but many of which we've contributed to, we find ourselves in what we regard as an unlucky situation, whereby people are coming to Australia in ways that we prefer them not to. Might the decent thing be to respond compassionately to these asylum seekers, to offer permanent refuge to those who deserve it, and to deal compassionately nevertheless with those who don't? At the same time, we could direct the resources and energy that we're currently wasting on offshore processing into working collaboratively and energetically with our neighbours and with the United Nations. We might end up with 100,000 more people in the country than we wanted. That might be a bad thing. But who knows, perhaps it might turn out to be good. But even if it created a burden for us, it's only a burden we're sharing across the world, and a reasonable ransom for us to pay for the spoils that each of us has accumulated through globalisation. All of us, and it's not just the nationalists and the neocons, are prone to retreat from decency and to act according to fear and greed. Then we see the other as hostile and dangerous, and that justifies our ruthless self-interest. This is a kind of survival state. It's adaptive for infants, and it's also adaptive for under extreme threat at other times of life. But we're not under extreme threat. And it should give way to different attitude at other times, the empathic concern for others, and a desire to make reparation for any damage that we've done. These are the qualities that characterise decency. Now, the empathy I've talked about can come easily. When I walked into the Woomera Immigration Detention Centre, the first thing I saw was sad children locked behind razor wire who looked just like my own daughters. I was hooked on the injustice of it straight away. But the kind of empathy that's needed from people who don't have the opportunity to go into those kind of circumstances in order that we can all behave decently towards refugees is more demanding, and it requires that we actively put ourselves into the shoes of these faceless aliens. It requires active imaginative engagement with other people's feelings and stories to stop us seeing asylum seekers as a problem requiring a solution. Isn't that an historically unfortunate word to use, rather than seeing them as people? And it's not enough to be concerned at a distance. We must directly act towards people with humanity. But of course, many factors conspire to keep asylum seekers at a distance. There's a disconnect between the flow of asylum seekers and Australia's role in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's combined with the fact that very few of us have any experience of the reality of war. We have media and governments which dehumanise refugees under the cover of their right to privacy. We don't get to know anything about refugees, a rare exception being the coverage of the funerals of some of the victims in the first Christmas Island shipwreck. And I think that coverage had a real impact on the way people thought about refugees. Being and working to become empathic is potentially painful, especially for those of us who struggle to tolerate healthy but potentially uncomfortable feelings like anger, shame and sadness. And because it's painful, we're all subject to retreating, perhaps to a state dominated by fear and self-interest, or to despair, or to manic excitement and the reckless pursuit of personal happiness and achievement. John Howard was expert at leading Australia towards a stance of fear and greed. We were encouraged to be fearful of foreigners and terrorism and to be proud of amassing wealth for our family, that convenient rationale for personal greed. In that environment, it was a small step for him to exploit a willing media through Children Overboard and other shameful misrepresentations to skillfully manufacture public support for the cruel treatment of asylum seekers. Who else has failed the decency test in relation to asylum seekers? Amanda Vanstone and Philip Ruddock for explicitly setting out to use the suffering of children as a deterrent. More of that later. The editor of the Australian newspaper, Chris Mitchell, and his journalists, notably Greg Sheridan, who've consistently misrepresented the nature and motives of asylum seekers in terms of religious extremism, violence, and have fuelled resentment at the cost burden of processing asylum seekers. A recent example was Sheridan's characterisation of asylum seekers as manifesting a determined Muslim migration. And the subsequent Labor government, which, while it's done some decent things, such as the various apologies and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, has increasingly lacked the courage to stand up against largely manufactured public opinion. Decency doesn't imply passivity in the face of adversity. Protest and vigorous advocacies are markers of decency. But authorities don't like it when victims protest. Protesting children get labelled with ADHD, psychiatric patients get sedated, and so do some asylum seekers. Nobody much seems to recognise that protest is a sign of hope, and that it's when people stop protesting that we should worry. When working with adults in immigration detention, I've repeatedly observed a pattern, particularly with single men, that saw them pass through 3 phases. To begin with, they were positive, engaged with trying to improve their English, playing soccer, looking for opportunity to do bits of work in the detention centre. As their level of frustration increased, they engaged in protest, sometimes quite destructively, lip-sewing, violence, etc. This was at the point at which they'd be referred for psychiatric attention, and certainly many of them had a high level of psychiatric symptoms. But to make a psychiatric diagnosis was really missing the point. Anyway, if they received a visa at that stage, there was a good chance of a positive mental health outcome for them. But for those who didn't, I'd frequently see a third stage in their development, I'd hear from detention centre staff that such and such a detainee was much better. He isn't aggressive anymore. He spends most of his time quietly in his room. But this turned out to be a very bad sign, because protest, no matter how destructive, signalled hope, while withdrawal from protest signalled despair. Of the men I saw who reached this given-up state, very few made a good recovery once they were eventually released. I'm prepared to accept that some asylum seekers are not worthy of refugee status, though that number is very low. It's claimed that some asylum seekers might be dangerous to our community, though there's no publicly available evidence to support that claim. It's also claimed that ill treatment of asylum seekers may have kept some others from attempting a boat journey to Australia, but I know of no evidence to support that claim. But if all those claims were accurate, is our response to asylum seekers proportionate? There are three questions worth asking. First, do we make a decent enough attempt to protect asylum seekers as they head for our shores? Now, the Defence Minister recently strongly defended the bravery and compassion of naval and border protection staff when they've been criticised for not acting enough to save lives or to retrieve dead bodies. Yet I'm left with a lingering feeling of disproportion in what we could confidently predict would be the response to a lone yachtsman who might be aiming to circumnavigate the globe for pleasure or personal gain, and certainly under no pressure to escape adversity, who might happen to disappear from radio contact in heavy seas far outside Australian waters. The cost might run into millions of dollars and serious risk to life, as well as diversion of resources from other tasks. Now, we know that asylum boats are going to founder. If the guiding moral principle was preservation of life, more assertive monitoring of boats throughout their course, whether or not they were in Australian waters, would save lives. The second question is, do we make a decent effort to protect the mental health of asylum seekers? Australian policies have demonstrably had a negative effect on the mental health of adults and children. Thousands of detainees are in facilities assessed by the Commonwealth Ombudsman and the Australian Human Rights Commission as inappropriate, grossly overcrowded, with poor and unhygienic amenities and excessive security measures, especially for single adult males. While the detention environment 10 years ago exposed detainees to much higher levels of conflict, violence and self-harm, we now see the emergence of the same sorts of psychiatric disturbances that we saw back then. Families particularly complain about the lack of freedom, all movements controlled by guards who are constantly present, and detainees are subject to intrusive head counts, even in those centres that offer quite pleasant surroundings. And is it actually surprising that incarceration, even in less awful circumstances, is antithetical to mental health? The inevitable uncertainty about refugee status is exacerbated by a range of petty cruelties and the bureaucratisation of daily life. In January of 2011, I was asked to see a 3-year-old girl from Inverbrackie. Inverbrackie, as you probably know, is a detention centre in the Adelaide Hills, and as detention centres go, it's a pretty comfortable place to be. It's an old army accommodation. It's in a beautiful piece of countryside. This 3-year-old was waking at night screaming. She was aggressive but very clingy, wouldn't let her mother go. Her toileting had regressed, and she was fighting with a toddler who was living in the same house. This family were being forced to live in one 2-bedroom house with another family who they didn't know, came from a different cultural group. The family consisted of a father, mother and 2 children. The father had been separated from the rest of the family for 7 months prior to their escape from their country of origin, and he'd received serious and considerable physical injuries during that time. They'd been in Indonesia for 3 months. They'd made a 10-day journey to Australia in a boat. that had very little food and water on board and no toileting facilities and was crowded, and they felt at risk for their life. In fact, this little 3-year-old fell off the boat and was rescued by the captain of the boat. They spent 2 months in Christmas Island and another 6 months in Darwin. When I saw her, the GP who'd referred her to me, a wonderful woman who subsequently didn't have her contract renewed at Inverbrackie, we agreed that it was urgent as a first aid measure for this family to have a house of their own within Inverbrackie where they could settle down a bit and feel a bit safer and get on with some of the healing process. We were told that was out of the question. Subsequently, I saw this little girl's 8-year-old brother a week or so later. He talked about being in prison. He was one of the most miserable 8-year-olds I've ever seen. He would only sleep when he was in actual physical contact with his mother, but he woke up often during the night, and every time he woke up, he woke his mother up. She was therefore sleep deprived with these 2 children, and that was exacerbating a significant level of distress that she was feeling about events that had occurred while she'd been in detention in Australia. All of this was exacerbated by the fact that the guards could come into their house at any time of the day or night to do a head count. We worked very hard to try and pass on a sense of urgency about something happening for this family. And somebody from immigration contacted us and said, we can do better than putting this family into their own house at Inverbrackie. What we'll do is we'll get them out into the community. But there are a few steps we need to go through, and I'll get back to you in a couple of weeks and let you know how things are going. When we got angry about that and said that we didn't think that was good enough, we went to the health people to talk about it, and they said, you need to talk to the immigration people. Who can we talk to in immigration? Sorry, I can't tell you who the case manager is. I wasn't allowed to go to Inverbrackie to visit my family or to see the circumstances in which they lived. Now, I described those frustrations that I experienced partly because they had a negative impact on the family that I was trying to help, but also to give you an insight into the kinds of frustrations that these families experience on a daily basis in the detention environment, which dwarf the frustrations that I experienced in the process of trying to be helpful towards them. And anybody who's experienced an unpleasant half hour in an airport or in the Medicare office or whatever, if you think about that as being an essential part of the daily experience every day of refugees in detention, it gives you some idea of just what those petty cruelties and bureaucratisation can do to people, how demeaning and how breaking down of mental health those experiences are. And that puts an extra burden of responsibility on us, because if we increase the vulnerability of a person by imprisoning them and otherwise mistreating them, we have a greater responsibility to protect them. And this same argument, of course, applies to Indigenous people in Australia who we've harmed. My third question is it decent to mistreat refugees in order to deter others from following in their footsteps? Now, the rhetoric of deterrence, which had receded with the change of government in 2007, has fully re-emerged. You may be aware that it was in 1992 that when mandatory detention was brought in by Jerry Hand, and he made it explicit that detention legislation was intended as a deterrent, aimed at sending a clear signal that migration to Australia may not be achieved by simply arriving in the country. But it's not clear that the legislators intended to extend the measures to deliberately harming asylum seekers. But under the Howard government, the harm to children and their caregivers went beyond passive failure of the state to protect them. In 2004, Immigration Minister Vanstone responded to the Human Rights Commission having recommended the immediate release of children from immigration detention by defending keeping children locked up on the basis that, I quote, the government's strong but fair border protection policies have had an impact. That is, it works, so we need to keep doing it. And Attorney General Ruddock stated that, quote, while deterrence is not a primary purpose of detention, it's an important incidental factor. End of quote. In the face of considerable public evidence about the harmful psychological impact of detention on children and families, such statements can only be read as aiming to justify the damage done to children on the grounds that there's a greater benefit to others through successfully deterring or discouraging further attempts to seek asylum. It would be nice if we believed that the others who are being protected were the asylum seekers themselves, as is often presented to us, but I'm sure that most people here would share the view that the people who are being protected are us. Now, it is possible to mount an ethical defence for the harsh treatment of asylum seekers. According to a consequentialist argument, if it can be demonstrated that the benefit of mandatory detention, including the mistreatment of children, is greater than the cost in terms of harm, then the action is ethical. You might be familiar with a similar defence of torture, the so-called ticking bomb argument, whereby the harm caused to the person being tortured and to the person carrying out the torture is outweighed by the benefit. That is, in torturing a terrorist who's planted a bomb, we elicit information to save lives. But to overturn the common sense conclusion that torture is inhumane, we require very good evidence for the effectiveness, and of course such evidence is lacking. So it is for the draconian measures put forward as being an effective deterrent for asylum seekers. The strongest claimed benefit for deterring them was reducing their exposure to dangerous travel in unsafe vessels, though they continue to be desperate enough to take such risks, even in the face of increasingly punitive responses. We're also said to be protecting asylum seekers from exploitation by people smugglers, as if they weren't mostly competent to make their own decision about how they spend their money, or keeping out more deserving refugees by queue jumping, or exposing us to the risk of terrorism. Now, none of these arguments stand up, and against these claimed benefits are the costs of immigration detention. These include harm as a result of maltreatment, the money spent on deterrence that's unavailable for other opportunities in health, education or overseas aid, the cost to our national reputation, to our self-respect as citizens, and the human costs relating to the harm done to those entrusted with enforcing the policy. And we know how damaged some of the people who were guards in Woomera and Baxter were by that experience. So after 20 years, it's clear that Australia's immigration policy has had great human and material cost to individuals and to the nation, and little, if any, demonstrable benefit. Now we're being tested by the continuation of this behaviour, and each of us must find our own way to make a difference. As a psychiatrist, I have an obligation to document and protest against breaches of the rights of children and their caregivers. But we must also each, I think, aspire to lead a more decent life. This requires that we experience gratitude for good fortune rather than a sense of entitlement, making us more likely to want to share what we have. We need to be curious rather than stupid about the complex circumstances of refugees, which will make them into real people. We need to tolerate uncertainty rather than seeking simple solutions where there aren't any. We need to honestly face up to inconvenient truths, such as that we're using more than our fair share. We need to protest loudly rather than turning a blind eye. We need to look for authentic stories rather than the bullshit of the kind fed to us by the Murdoch press. We need to exhibit true selfless kindness rather than currying favour. I think we need to do what we ought rather than what suits us to do. Since I've been thinking intensively about decency, I've actually caught myself being more respectful and generous in trivial ways. My behaviour in queues, for example, has improved. I did, however, note last week that it hasn't improved my behaviour in watching Adelaide get beaten by Richmond. Thank you.